to see that playing part of the role, I think was a big attraction. You see it elsewhere. You see it in the health service. You see it in social care, and I think the housing ombudsman should clearly play that role as well. I don't think there's been a greater focus on redress than there is now, so I wanted to get involved in that. And then I guess the final thing, and it shouldn't be underestimated, is, and I think it's a motivation for why many people work in our service, and certainly through that recruitment I talked about, it's something that we've seen people express a lot when they've applied for roles at the housing ombudsman, is the ability to make a difference. I mean, literally every day we're making around 10 orders or recommendations to put something right or make improvements. So on a daily basis, people are helping. And that, I think, is a huge draw for me, but a huge draw for a number of people who work at the service.
Yeah, brilliant. That's great. Thanks for that, Richard. Again, it's nice to get a bit of insight into you and your sort of motivations there. Okay, so we're going to get stuck into, I guess, some more of the sort of detail and some more of the more specific issues around at the moment. And one of the questions we've had in is around how the housing ombudsman is going to work with the regulator, so the social housing regulator. And tenants have noticed that there's a commitment to working closer, which is great. But what does this actually look like in practice? Could you outline a little bit of that for residents and tenants?
So thanks, Louise. It's a big issue, I think, this, and I think it's one that will evolve. And I mean, my sense is that lots of folk, landlords, residents, will not necessarily, necessarily see how the ombudsman and the regulator fit together as clearly as it should be. And I think there's a job there for both organisations, for us and for the regulator, to clearly demonstrate how we fit together. So and the important thing I think to remember about an ombudsman in trying to piece that together is that we're obviously not the courts and we're not a regulator. We're different to that, and that is I think a really key thing. So I mean, I think the relationship works on two levels. So one is quite a formal level. When we've decided on a case, if we think there might be an issue that where consumer regulations have been breached, or an issue with a landlord that needs to be referred to the regulator, we can do that. As we know, the threshold that the regulator currently has around serious judgment and things like that is quite high. But and previously, until we had this revised scheme come in, we were only really able to refer where there was non-compliance with our orders by a landlord. And actually, non-compliance is something we really don't see very often. Most landlords are compliant within 3 months of the order having to be met. So that's, so there's we have quite a high level of compliance by landlords. So that basis on which we can formally refer a case has been broadened out, and it's been broadened out, for example, into sort of systemic failures is one of the key things, where we're seeing something happening repeatedly. So there's the formal basis on which we can refer. There's then the more, what I would say, sort of informal working, which is that sharing of information and intelligence. And I think that's really at the heart of kind of some of the work that the two organisations do, and that will inform a broad set of work that the regulator does around its global risk analysis that it does, its consumer regulation review. The information that we can share feeds into all of that analysis that they do. And we have regular meetings. Emma and I are regularly meeting with the regulator, and we're sharing kind of intelligence and insights from what we're seeing. So you've got individual cases formally referred, and then you've got the informal working of intelligence sharing. And we have a new, what we call a memorandum of understanding, a sort of working arrangement that was published alongside the scheme in September. So there's more detail there in the MOU that's available on our website or the regulator's website, which gives a sense of how we're working. I think it will continue to evolve, as I say, and I think there is more that we can do together to be able to explain how we do work together. And I think the last thing I'd say on this, because it's really, is that where something's gone wrong, we always want to be proportionate, and we always want to ensure that the landlord has an opportunity to put something right first before we refer to the regulator. So that referral to the regulator really should be a last resort. And that, I think, is a key thing which guides the way we work.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. Really interesting to hear how that relationship's going to develop, and some of the points there I'm sure will be of interest to our members. I'm going to take one more written question, then I'm going to go to the audience who've joined us today and see if they've got one to ask you, Richard. But just wanted to touch on the designated person's role with you, because I know we have members and residents and tenants who are involved in that as a tenant panel, but we understand that now it's likely that this is going to be removed. Where do you think that sort of leaves tenant panels when it comes to being involved in complaints, and what kind of role could they still play, do you think?
Yeah, so I think they got an important role to play. I think the designated person was, was the right idea that's not worked in practice, is what we would observe as an ombudsman. I mean, the fact that last year, 94% of the cases that we handled, investigations that we conducted, had to wait 8 weeks because they weren't referred, and obviously weren't resolved by the designated person, means that you're building in a 2-month delay for the overwhelming majority of residents. And if you've got a repair that, you want to be investigated, building in that 2 months is obviously not desirable. There are in my mind, there are sort of 2 types of sort of resident panel when it comes to engaging with landlord. There was the designated resident panels, obviously set up to handle complaints and so on. And as part of the changes, clearly their role will change in terms of formally referring cases, potentially referring cases to us, and they're distinct clearly to the whole range of different types of resident tenant panel that you have with a landlord as well. I mean, as far as we're concerned, we see a great role for residents in supporting complaint resolution or working on complaint resolution. And it's something which we encourage in our complaint handling code that we published earlier this year. And it's something, and the ability where residents being involved can help to the earlier and local resolution of complaint. That's brilliant. That's what we want to see. And that's part of our ethos as an organization. So even though the kind of formal designated panel role referring a case to us could change subject to what happens with the legislation, that doesn't mean the wider role of working on complaints and being involved, it's necessarily lost. And as I say, it's something which we strongly encourage through our code.
Excellent. I think that's really good to hear, and will reassure a lot of residents who are involved in that, that there's still, a role to play, albeit maybe not in the formal way that that they've been used to, perhaps with the designated panel. So thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to go to the audience and take some questions from there. We've got one in the chat, which relates very specifically to the code that you've mentioned, Richard. So Mark's question is 6.5. Very specific in the code, apparently says put right processes and systems. And then the question is, how are you doing this in practice? I don't know if that makes sense in terms of that question.
So let me let me sort of set out where we are in terms of the code. So we published the code in July, and we gave, between now and Christmas, basically between now and the end of the year, a window for landlords to self-assess their policies and procedures against the code. And it's for them to conduct, that's a self-assessment on a comply or explain basis. It's for them to conduct that, to report it to the outcome to their board, and to publish the outcome, so it's transparent. We've then, where adjustments need to be made, we've given landlords a little bit longer. So they've got until the end of our financial year, so until the end of March, to make any adjustments. We obviously encourage them to do it as soon as possible, where it needs to be done. And so, you know, if you conducted your self-assessment, you know, now, and you know you need to make adjustments, we'd encourage you to do that now. Don't wait, but, you know, we needed a sort of hard deadline. So that's the kind of process through which we're expecting landlords, all landlords, to go. And, you know, in some cases they will, you know, they will look to make adjustments, and we're obviously hearing that they want to make adjustments to their policies. I mean, one of the big things in the code is obviously the number of stages. And, you know, our approach with the code is to try and get the right culture. I know that's something TPAS has spoken really strongly about, getting the right culture around complaints and complaint handling. We try and encourage the right culture. And we take a very sort of principles-based approach. But where we've been kind of more prescriptive, it's because we think consistency really matters. And one of the key ways in which we've been prescriptive is around the number of stages. We don't think one-stage processes are necessarily appropriate, because that means that it limits the landlord's scope to really be able to use their complaints process to resolve an issue. But nor do we think multiple stages are necessarily appropriate either, because that can lead to kind of fatigue around handling complaints, the escalation or entrenchment of issues. So we've opted for our preference being 2 stages, with a 3rd stage is absolutely necessary. And again, one of the ways in which we thought a 3rd stage might be appropriate is where a landlord wants to use, say, the resident group, or more senior people within an organisation if they've not done it earlier in the process. So those are some of the adjustments we're expecting to see. I don't know if that helps at all. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, sorry, I'm probably been far too specific. I was interested in whether it was about your complaints process or housing process. Are you making recommendations on fixing housing process? And perhaps we can talk later about that. That would be useful.
Yeah, sure. Of course, very happy to. It's the complaints. We're focused on the formal complaints process.
Yeah, there's quite a few questions coming in, specific questions around the code, which I will try and pick up, but I think we're just going to have to maybe keep it a little bit more general at the moment. But I will try and bring some of those questions in if we do get time. Just something to clear up, Richard, around private landlords. We've got a question about how the code applies to them. Do you want to say a little bit about your sort of jurisdiction around that for us, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So you have to be a member of our scheme for the code to apply to you. So we have, so all social landlords by statute have to be members of our scheme. So it applies to them. But, you know, so that's all councils and that's all housing associations, there's obviously cooperatives. So if you're kind of regulated, you're in. On the private landlords, we have a small number, 73 I think private landlords who are voluntary members of the Housing Ombudsman scheme, and obviously as being members, we expect them to, you know, apply the code, and we're working with them, encouraging them to do that. But the vast majority of obviously private landlords out there are not, you know, don't have to be members of the Housing Ombudsman and are not members of the Housing Ombudsman, so it doesn't reach them.
Okay, thanks for that, clearing that up, Richard. That's helpful. Just on the code, because again, a few more questions are coming in on this. So just trying to condense and summarise these. I think there's a question here around if a complainant is dissatisfied. How do they express this? Again, I think it might be a little bit specific. So maybe we could pick some of these up in the written responses, Richard, if that's okay, in terms of responding to those, particularly the questions around the code. So I just want to sort of move on to the white paper, because we have had a few questions in about the forthcoming white paper, because clearly one of the principles in there was around complaints. And we just wanted to get your view about what would you like to see in that, or is there anything you can reveal to us in advance, maybe, about the complaints and the white paper?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, a couple of things just on the code. I mean, happy to pick up more stuff, obviously, in the code on this. Happy to do it in written responses as well. And we also host, as an organisation, our sort of webinars on the complaint handling code where we explain it in more detail, and there's an opportunity to ask questions of the team as well. So there's a number of channels, and happy to use all of those, because it is a really big thing, and it's 2,300 landlords in our jurisdiction, so it will affect a lot of all of those landlords and their residents. So it's a big thing. On the white paper, so I can't sorry to sound so don't wish to sound too kind of restricted. Can't speculate really on what the government will say. It's their document, obviously. I mean, the two things which I would consider in relation to it. The first is, it should be a big moment for the sector. I mean, I know it's a kind of basic statement to make, but it should really be a big moment for the sector, I hope, when we see the white paper. I think it should also build on what we saw in the green paper in relation to the role of complaints and the role of this service, the Housing Ombudsman Service. And I would want to see, I want to see recognition of that, because I think complaints are, have such a role to play in the sector, as I touched on earlier. And, it's an insight into the health, the performance of individual organizations, but also the sort of how the sector itself is evolves, and you'd want to see that in there. I think if looking at the green paper, obviously the role of regulation and the role of complaints were both touched on. So assuming that the white paper kind of moves that forward, I think those points that you made, Louise, around the relationship between the Ombudsman and the regulator, touching on that and how the organisations relate to each other, I think is is something which which is a natural progression from the green paper. So that's the kind of some of the space. But I think fundamentally, I'd say recognising the important role of complaints is, I think, what we would hope to see in the white paper.
Okay, thanks for that, Richard. Yeah, didn't want to close down the conversation at all around the code. I'm just kind of acknowledging there are some specifics in there that perhaps if you've not got it to hand or you've not sort of read it through, you may struggle with. But yeah, I mean, at the end, maybe we can open up, sort of save the last 5 minutes or so to have a wider discussion. And as you said, Richard, there are lots of other avenues as well, because it is a really important part of what's happening in the field of complaints. So we will pick that up.
Cool.
Okay. Have we got any more questions? Yeah, Paulette wants to know about accessing the webinars that were referred to. Yeah, TPAS are running some, if you check our website out, and I know the Housing Ombudsman have got some on their website, I think, as well. Is that right? So if you go to both those sites, you will find details of where they are, Paulette. Yeah. And then a question from John, who was in the audience. Will the Housing Ombudsman continue to engage with organisations ahead of their formal processes to try and achieve early resolution?
Yes. I mean, I think as a service, we're a bit different to many ombudsmen, I would say, in that we do resource and do quite a lot on complaints before they've exhausted the landlord's process. And they kind of potentially come to us to be formally investigated. We call that part of our service our sort of dispute support service and our dispute support team. We're growing that as part of the changes that we've been going through. Each year we have about 16,000 kind of complaints come across our desk, and the vast majority of those, about 80% of those cases, are closed at dispute support stage. And so that helpline and our advisors there are, I think, a key part of our service, and it's critical to try and just offer any advice or support that's appropriate at that stage to help facilitate resolution, potentially by the landlord. I think one of the big parts, I think, of that of that service is actually communication and engagement. Often people are coming to us because they've not been able to get engagement or response from their landlord. So I think a big part of our role at that stage is us, potentially contacting the landlord saying, look, we're aware of the complaint, we're aware of this issue, can you respond? And that is a really key part of what we do in dispute support.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Richard. Okay, just one more question from the audience, then we'll go back to the written questions. It's from Beatty Mary. She's got a question around what would the Housing Ombudsman do to help in a long-standing case where the complainant never truly completed the complaints process, but they can't go to the Ombudsman because the response is not clear. Again, I don't know if there's enough information there for you to be able to answer that, Richard, at all.
I mean, I'll give it a go, and I might ask Emma to join in as well. I think one of the key parts of the changes to the scheme that we made was to try and sort of strengthen our ability to take on complaints where we felt that they weren't progressing through the landlord's process. Potentially they'd exhausted the landlord's process, but there wasn't that kind of final response. And so our revised scheme has strengthened our ability to take on complaints where we consider that it's just not going to progress or be resolved through the landlord's own procedures. Aligned to that is something called complaint handling failure orders, which is a new provision that we will formally start to issue from January next year. And that's where, we're seeing a case and a landlord isn't doing something that they should be, either against the code or against the scheme. And again, there tends to be, we don't kind of issue those instantly, it tends to be a pattern that's built up. We've tried to engage with the landlord on several occasions and we've not got an appropriate response, or they've not done what they needed to do to progress a complaint. And then we can issue a failure order. And obviously at that point, we might consider, well, this is a complaint that we need to take on. Even though normally we're getting the evidence that the landlord's procedure has been exhausted, and that final response, we have got potentially in some cases that opportunity where we think it's appropriate. Emma, I don't know if you can elaborate on that.
Sorry, just unmuting. Yeah, no, I think you covered pretty much everything. I think the only thing that I would just say is that our first point of contact would be in trying to get the landlord to give you a formal response, because obviously if the landlord can actually identify where things have gone wrong and put things right without us having to make orders, that's a much better result than having to go through our process. So that would be our first point of contact. But then, as Richard said, if that we couldn't get a response, or it was still very unclear what was happening, then we would consider whether we would take it on for investigation.
Excellent. I hope that that answers the question for you, Mary. Okay, we are going to go back to the written questions. Interesting one here, and sort of a very relevant one for the time we're in at the moment. So this is about people advising people who are handling complaints around those things they're getting in to do with vulnerable and tenants facing arrears due to lockdown. So dealing with complaints, I guess, in the climate we're in at the moment. This person's saying that they're getting more contacts from people who are struggling financially, and their usual approach is perhaps deemed cold if they've got to follow legal processes. So is there any sort of best practice for supporting customers whilst taking action while they go through the complaints process? I don't know if that's something you've got a view on, but the whole sort of situation that we're in around complaints during the pandemic. Any thoughts on that, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of thoughts. So I think, during this, what I call the sort of strict lockdown, or the lockdown one, the sort of March to sort of June, July period, one of the things, whilst overall we had a kind of reduction in the number of complaints that we were receiving and the contacts that we were receiving as a service, I think we saw an increase in complexity of the kind of cases that were coming to us. And one of the things, certainly in that dispute support work that I talked about, that sort of frontline kind of, one of the, certainly what we were seeing is that people were approaching us about potentially a complaint that with their landlord, but also there were issues around debt, universal credit, and so on. And one of the things which we're obviously able to do there is, even if even though we can only investigate what's in our jurisdiction, we were doing a lot to signpost people to places where hopefully they might be able to get some support for some of those other issues, CAB, shelter, or so on, depending on their circumstances. I mean, the big thing that we've seen, and it's kind of persisted, is a reduction in, during that kind of COVID period, a reduction in complaints around repairs as a proportion of what we would usually be dealing with, which kind of, people can kind of, I'm sure, will recognise and understand why. And an increase, and this is just the way that they're classified by us, but an increase in what we kind of call antisocial behaviour complaints, or sort of antisocial behaviour complaints, which did increase significantly compared to what you would usually see. So it roughly doubled. I mean, and some of that was relating to things like social distancing and what people were seeing. So again, it's not necessarily, it gets labelled as that, but it was potentially kind of broader than some of the antisocial behaviour issues that we might typically deal with as a service. We're going to produce a report this month which looks at what we call kind of COVID-related complaints since services, a kind of full suite of services, started to remobilise, so really from July onwards. And we're going to publish an analysis of that, as I say, later this month, which will provide a bit more insight. In terms of guidance, which was kind of in the question, I mean, I think as I say, our dispute support teams can signpost people where we think it's right. Otherwise, when we publish our report later this month on COVID-related complaints, we'll be able to set out some of the things that we're seeing, some of the issues that we're seeing, and obviously people will be able to look at that and compare it to their own experiences.
Excellent, thank you for that. Okay, just want to talk to you a little bit about social media. I don't know if you're on Facebook or Twitter or all that kind of stuff, but obviously it's a big channel for people now to be using to submit complaints. So one of the questions we've had is around, do you have any advice on how best to respond to complaints that are made on social media? Would you do it via the same channel, or do you advise it's done off that and done privately? And also, does the Housing Ombudsman look at any of the stuff that's on social media to just pick up any intel or any trends? So any thoughts on social media?
Yeah, I mean, our service is on we do use Twitter and the like. So we do have some social media, and obviously we see issues and we make sure that there's links into our sort of caseworkers where something comes up. So we do see that, and it is incidentally a good way of kind of keeping up to speed with what we're doing as a service, through our newsletter and through the social media stuff. The code, I mean, the code dealt with this, touched on this, which is important to highlight. And I think one of the things that sits behind the code, and I think it really, is underscored by the use of social media, is ensuring that legitimate complaints are accepted and are investigated and progressed and dealt with. And I think, part of our concern, and this is why we've provided a universal definition of complaint in the code, which is, something we'll all be familiar with, but it tried to get that consistency. That's one of the reasons why we did that was to make sure that complaints aren't going, not being treated as a complaint when they should be. And the universal definition that we provided, it's 36 words long, roughly 36 words long, but there's 2 words which I'd really highlight in it, which are however made. So we're really clear that, however a complaint is made, it should be accepted and dealt with as a complaint. And if, for example, a landlord is very active in using social media, if it receives a complaint through social media, it should treat it as a complaint and then start to take it through its formal process. If that, So I think, look, it's going to grow. The use of, this stuff, it's just going to grow, and and it can't be that you have to go through a very narrowly prescribed kind of fill out this form and send it. That isn't appropriate. It should be, if you raise a complaint on Twitter or somewhere, it should be treated as that and taken on by the complaints team.
Okay, excellent. Okay, I'm going to go back to the audience and see if we've got some questions there. Yeah, we've got one from Lee Worsman, who's saying that a fundamental element of the code is to promote continuous improvement, both culturally and from a process or service perspective. Will the Housing Ombudsman be consolidating and sharing some of the good practice outcomes that are going to be driven, hopefully, by the code?
Yeah, it's a great question, Lee, and it's something I want to do a lot more on, and it's something also that I think I want the views of residents and TPAS to sort of say, this is what some of the things which we should think about, because I think sharing our sort of learning and best practice, as I said, is one of the attractions for me of taking on the role as Housing Ombudsman, and it's something that I really want to grow as within the service. And your thoughts on that would really, really help us in shaping and expanding it. But I think, the code was really, really clear on this point. As a service, we've talked about for a very long time, certainly before I joined, about learning from complaints and demonstrating the learning. So one of the things which the code tries to do is encourage boards to take an active part on it, to try and demonstrate the learning as part of the annual report, but don't stop there. Do much more than that. And I think demonstrating that learning to us, but more importantly, perhaps to residents, is, I think, a key thing that landlords need to do. And I think, just the other thing is, in terms of getting the right culture and I think complaints isn't just the sort of preserve of the complaints team. Within a landlord, everyone has a role to play on it. So, the senior directors have a role to play, boards have a role to play, and residents have a role to play and should be engaged and, part of that learning process. So that's the kind of ambition, I guess, that the code sets out, which I think will chime with many of the things which TPAS and residents have said over the years. And there's the ways in which we want to demonstrate learning as a service is we want to obviously publish more information, both on individual landlords and individual cases. We want to do more through our insight reports and try and provide sort of learning, geographically as well as globally in terms of the service. What we see across England. We want to sort of say this is what we saw in the northeast or the southwest. We want to try and provide a bit more information on that basis. Size and scale of landlords, because we've got a broad membership, so we want to try and unpack that membership, because some learning might feel more pertinent to some landlords because of the type or size or location of that landlord. We want to publish more of our thematic reports that we do. So we did something on leaseholders and shared owners recently. We're preparing something at the moment on heating and hot water, which includes gas safety inspections, boilers, all sorts in that. So we want to publish more of those reports, potentially for a year, which can provide some learning. And we want to engage people both before and after publication. So we want to engage residents and landlords as we're preparing the report, sort of say, these are some of the issues we've seen. This is what the data is telling us that we have as a service, on the scale or frequency of issues. Does that chime? Any thoughts on that? And then after publication, link it into the kind of webinars that we do as a service, some of the training that we offer, some of the sector engagement stuff that we do. So there's sorry, so it's a slightly long answer, but I think it's, the final thought is to re-emphasize, providing your thoughts on what you want to see us saying around learning, what is really useful. We're really listening. It's going to be part of our business plan consultation when we do it later this year. We're setting up a residents panel, which we want to have quite a big membership of, about 100 residents represented on that panel, which is, you know, much bigger than we've had in the past with our customer panel. So we want to grow that, and they can provide insights. So there's lots of ways in which we want to engage. And I just sort of say, you know, either through TPAS or direct with us, just get in touch, and it would be great to do more on this.
Excellent. I think everybody will really welcome what you've said, Richard, and look forward to developing relationships as we go forward. So thank you for that. I'm just going to go to the written question. I think it's a really interesting this one. It's from an operational manager, just saying that in housing, there's been a tradition maybe of training staff not to accept liability for fear of litigation. And how can you admit you got it wrong and work with complainants to improve things? And again, I suppose it's back to the culture, but is there any advice that you could offer, you know, staff who do find themselves maybe in this situation?
I think it's a really, strong point. I mean, a couple of things. As a service, one of the orders or recommendations, but you know, typically it will be an order that we can make, is to issue an apology, to make an apology. And given that the heart of what we do as a service is around the sort of tenant-landlord relationship, and you know, I'm very keen as a service for us to think about how our practices of complaint resolution, dispute resolution can kind of rebuild or strengthen the tenant-landlord relationship. You know, that act of making an apology can be a key part. If trust is broken down, the act of making an apology is almost the starting point, or one of the starting points, to rebuilding that relationship, which is likely, you know, to last a lifetime, you know, and that is, you know, I think that's really, really, really important. And I can see why officers will feel, you know, they've got to defend. But actually being defensive through the complaints process is often going to just firstly mean that learning is lost, but also on an individual basis that issues become entrenched, that landlord-tenant relationship breaks down. So trying not to be defensive, I think, is critical. And making an apology, you know, is something we might order, but it's often something which is really, really key and shouldn't be ignored. And a point which I know Emma would make is very much not making an apology or being defensive is more likely to lead to a legal challenge or litigation. So actually, if you're worried about, you know, making an apology might lead to litigation, actually not making an apology, more likelihood, is more likely to lead to the issue escalating and potentially ending up with a legal dispute.
Yeah. I think that's sound advice there, and words of wisdom, I think, Richard, on that one. So thank you for that. I'm just going to go back to those questions on the code now, because I don't want people who put them forward to feel that they've not had those looked at. But what I'm going to do is ask them to ask the question, because I think they've probably got a bit more understanding in terms of what they're looking for. So Val, are you there, Val? TPAS used to be, yeah. Val, do you want to put your question? Yeah, just be better, I think, coming from yourself.
Yeah, it's just that the definition, obviously, in the guide is that any expression of dissatisfaction is a complaint, which is something that I think I've upheld and TPAS uphold throughout the training on the designated persons. But that's quite a difficult concept to get across within an organisation. Because it's that when is it an expression of dissatisfaction, and really understanding that any member of staff can move forward a complaint, and just because it is a complaint doesn't mean to say it's necessarily negative, because it gives us an opportunity to sort it out. So it's going back to, I think, what was just asked. It's about that cultural thing, and any advice on making those cultural changes.
Yeah, to play it back slightly, I do think, obviously the culture needs to be owned by the organisation, for it to really be embedded in the organisation. I mean, I think the point that you raised is a really, really fair one. And certainly through the engagement that we've done since the code, it's kind of was published, it's come up as a theme. So I might ask Emma to say a bit bit more on it, but I think to be really clear about parameters. So one of the things which we've said about the code is it's very much focused on the formal process. Obviously, if someone has a kind of dissatisfaction and they raise something and they want to try and get something just fixed, and that's, if you like, informal and outside the formal process, as an organisation, as an ombudsman service, we don't want to stop that happening. If you can get, if you can get something fixed quickly, without going through the full complaints process, and that obviously should be something that landlords should seek to do and residents should be able to ask for. I think what's important, though, is if for whatever reason it isn't fixed, that there's both a record of what the engagement was by the landlord, because that's important, but also that the resident is really clear that they can then escalate it and take it through a complaints process. So we're trying to be really clear that the code is about the formal process, and be really clear that there is space for that kind of informal resolution of kind of issues when they arise. Otherwise, in terms of getting the right culture, I mean, I think hopefully the stuff that we set out in the code are kind of strong pointers to what we think make for a strong kind of culture and the right behaviours in terms of addressing complaints. And we talk a lot about the way in which staff should behave, and and so on. But that has to be owned by the organisation, and almost be sort of organic within an organisation, which I think through the self-assessment, reflecting on culture and the touch points in relation to the code, I think is a really important thing about that self-assessment. But then keep doing it. Self-assessment isn't just a kind of one-off exercise. It's something that we would encourage landlords to periodically do. Emma, is there anything you want to add to Val's question?
I guess all I would say is that I would support what Richard says about culture, and I think what's really important is that all staff are able to buy into that culture, so that you're actually empowering your staff to enable them to put things right when a problem is presented to them, so that you move away from, as we've already discussed, that sort of I can't say that anything went wrong culture, but that actually what your staff are driven by is a desire to actually get things sorted, put things right, and so that needs to filter all the way down and through to frontline staff, so that actually they don't feel, oh, I need to refer this to my manager. If it's something that they could just pick up the phone and get sorted themselves, they do it. But so that's sort of how you start embedding it, I think, is by ensuring that staff are sort of supported to feel that actually they can get in and get it sorted and help move things on themselves.
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks for that, Val. And I'm going to next, I think it's a gentleman, it could be a lady. W. Creelman asked a question about the self-assessment. I don't know if you want to come in and put your question to Richard and to Emma. No, maybe not. Okay, not to worry. Well, if
sorry, I am still here. I couldn't unmute. Sorry, Louise.
No, fine.
Which question did you have in mind? Because I raised quite a few, and I'm precious. There's time and stuff.
Yeah. If you just want to pick the one you want to put forward, that's fine.
Okay, we're anticipating in the white paper that there's going to be a new suite of KPIs, and I think there's a particular question in the self-assessment of the code that relates to customer satisfaction. And I know there's lots of debates going on at the moment regarding quantitative sort of data regarding, or what the sort of the residents truly feel and stuff. So regarding the self-assessment element, we're trying to find out whether the question of the number of complaints that have been resolved to customer satisfaction, is that from a KPI sort of measuring the percentage of customers who we've asked, are they satisfied, or by looking at the ones that haven't escalated any further? Because they do come up with two different figures when we sort of look at monitoring them, because some people that they've maybe accepted the decision, but they're not happy with it. So their satisfaction will be, well, no, because I haven't got the answer that we've got. So just wondered really if there was any guidance on that, or whether we need to wait and see what the new suite of KPIs might be in the white paper.
I mean, I think we probably do need to just see what the suite of KPIs are, if there are KPIs in the white paper. But I think I mean, there's been this discussion about, well, there won't be KPIs for a while, and I think, well, and my view is that the code is kind of independent of that. So this is very much about the sort of measures which you as a landlord would be using, and which will be independent of anything else that may or may not happen in the future. So I think that's the basis on which kind of we envisage the code. Emma, do you want to say anything on that, sort of to add on that?
Yeah, I will. I guess what I would just say is that the self-assessment piece was largely supposed to be a sort of tool to help landlords learn. So if you've got two sets of figures there and they're telling you something different, I would say you've already started that learning process. What are those two sets of figures telling you, and what is the difference? And we were never intending to kind of monitor what's going on for each individual landlord, because we simply don't have the capacity. So the whole aim was to sort of hand it over to you and go, have a look at this. Is there something there that you could be doing better, or you could be there is a gap? And I think you've already identified something there.
Yeah, and I think one set of data is very business driven, isn't it? That the percentage of ones that don't escalate, and you kind of then make the presumption that they are, and then the actual asking whether they are satisfied, and just because they haven't escalated doesn't mean that they're satisfied. So yeah, I think you're right. We have sort of answered our own question, but just wasn't sure which sort of set we were looking at. Thank you.
All right.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So yeah, a couple of questions there on the code, which was really good to see. And I noticed somebody's put a link to the webinar from the Housing Ombudsman site onto the chat, so you can pick that up there. I think that was Paulette. Thank you for that, Paulette. Appreciate that. So we've got about, I think, 5 minutes left to run. So I'm just going to go to a few more questions that we've had sent in to us. I think this is an interesting one. Time to get your crystal ball out, I think, Richard and Emma. What do you think are the main challenges facing the Housing Ombudsman, say, in the next 12 months?
So I think there's so I think the big challenge that we've got is actually the fact that we are going to publish a lot more information about what we're doing as a service. And I think that means a couple of things. Firstly, I think that changes our relationship, with both residents and landlords, because we will, next year be publishing all of the decisions that we make. We'll be publishing reports on all of the landlords where we've handled in our jurisdiction, where we've handled complaints during the year. And that is a sort of unprecedented level of kind of transparency by us as a, and that inevitably will change the relationship that we have. It will change awareness of complaints. I think one of the really important things for us to keep doing as an organisation is demonstrate the difference that complaints can make. The difference to that individual in terms of fixing something. If we've investigated and found there was, something had gone wrong, as well as that wider learning that we've talked about. And it also sort of invites some scrutiny, greater scrutiny of us. So I think that is that's a kind of journey that we've just started in the last few months, but that will really accelerate over the next 12 months. And that will throw up new things and new challenges as a result that will and I think that's we've got to navigate that. But it's really positive. I'm really keen we demystify the role of the Ombudsman, and it shouldn't be remote and obscure. And I think us just being a bit more open with what we're doing and the decisions we're making is a key part of that.
Yeah. Excellent. Just probably linked to that a little bit. I mean, for people maybe saw Inside Housing and saw the information, and dare we call it a league table maybe, that was published around complaints. Just wondered what the reaction had been. What had you picked up maybe in terms of how people received that information, and did you feel that it was welcomed by the sector?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say this was a piece of work by Inside Housing. So they, they access the information under the Freedom of Information, so they so that was very much their publication rather than our kind of publication. And I think that whether it's that or the publication we did recently of severe maladministration findings, or the leasehold report, or all these, for the most part, I found landlords have responded by, recognizing where something has gone wrong, and and they've, for the most part, kind of I think it has underscored the value in that information being shared, and it's brought to the attention, it's got traction within landlords perhaps on some issues that otherwise not been. Certainly on the leasehold report, some board members approached me and said, look, we've talked about this in a way that wasn't necessarily happening, so I think there is, so I found the response by landlords have been constructive.
That's good. Really good to hear that. Okay, I just want to finish off then, because we are, gosh, that hour's just flown by, so we are coming up to finishing time. But just want to finish on these particular points that were sent in to us. So, if you could offer or give landlords one piece of advice, only one piece, when it comes to dealing with complaints, what would this be? And if you could give tenants one piece of advice when it comes to making a complaint, what would this be?
Okay, so on the landlords, I think communication has been critical. We've seen it during the sort of COVID period in particular, but it goes, the breakdown in communication that so often happens around a complaint is a real concern, and often will contribute to the kind of findings that we make. And so I think effective communication has got to be key to that. I mean, potentially, providing updates on issues, even if there isn't new information. I know that there's capacity issues and resource, but all of that just, I think, helps enormously. And again, comes back to the sort of landlord-tenant relationship. On the tenant front, I think being really clear about what outcome do you want. So we will hear a sort of the issue that is being experienced by that tenant, and it's been really, really clear. Well, what would put it right? What outcome do you want? And also reflecting, what do you think that's realistic? Is that, if that would put it right, is that realistic? Is that going to happen? So that, effective communication by the landlords, and being clear on that, what needs to happen to put something right. What outcome do you want if you're a tenant? Those would be our suggestions.
Excellent. And yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with those. I think everybody who works in complaints or has had some role in complaints would definitely sign up to better communication and clearer outcomes. Absolutely, yeah. Richard. So thank you for that. Okay, well, we have come to the end of today's session. Just want to say a big thank you, obviously, to Richard and to Emma for joining us today, and also to just feedback some of the really positive responses we've had from our members about how the Housing Ombudsman's definitely changing and has changed, and really connecting back particularly with the residents in this way. And today's just been another example of that. So big thank you to you both, and thank you to all our members who've joined us today. Maybe we'll invite Emma and Richard back again. I'm sure that would be extremely popular, and we will follow up, as we said, with some written responses if we didn't get round to your question. But thank you again, and yeah, have a good day, everyone, and keep safe and well, and we hope to see you again very soon.
Cool. Thanks so much, Louise. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.
just stopping the video. I always forget to do that.
I don't know.